What if Steve Rogers never actually finished his final mission? What if, when Captain America disappeared at the end of Avengers Endgame, he wasn't simply traveling through time to return the Infinity Stones? What if someone was waiting for him? Because there is one part of Steve Rogers' ending that we've never actually seen. We never see the journey. We never see Steve return every single stone. We never see what happened when he reached Vormir. We never see him make the decision to stay with Peggy Carter. And we never see exactly how he made his way back to that bench. We only see the beginning. And then the result. Steve disappears as a young man. And moments later, an old Steve Rogers is sitting quietly near the lake, wearing the life of someone who apparently got the one thing he had been denied for almost his entire existence: a life with Peggy. For years, we've treated that ending as the reward Steve finally earned. After decades of sacrifice, after losing his entire generation, after fighting for people who would never fully understand what he had given up, Steve finally chose himself. But what if that choice wasn't entirely his? What if the greatest emotional decision of Steve Rogers' life was actually the most carefully constructed trap in the entire multiverse saga? Because if Doctor Doom is truly the kind of mastermind we believe he could be, then he wouldn't need to defeat Captain America in a fight. He wouldn't need an army. He wouldn't need to overpower him. He would only need to understand him. And there may be no one better suited to help him do that than the one person from Steve's past who already understood exactly what Captain America had sacrificed: Red Skull. Think about that connection for a moment. Steve Rogers and Red Skull are not just two characters who happened to fight during World War II. They are ideological opposites. Steve represented everything Red Skull wanted to destroy. Red Skull represented everything Steve had spent his life fighting against: Hydra, power without morality, the belief that humanity could be controlled through fear. And eventually, Steve defeated him. But Red Skull's story didn't end there. He was sent to Vormir, transformed into something completely different, and forced to spend years guarding the Soul Stone. And then, decades later, the man he had once fought appears on his planet: Captain America, alone, carrying the very stones that could reshape the fate of the universe. Now imagine that moment from Red Skull's perspective. Steve Rogers is no longer surrounded by the Avengers. No Bucky, no Tony, no Thor, no army, no shield, just Steve. And he's following a mission that has already been carefully explained to him. Return the stones. Put them back exactly where they were taken. Don't create another branch. Don't disturb the timeline. Finish the job and go home. Except maybe Red Skull knows something Steve doesn't. Maybe someone else has already been watching the timeline. Maybe someone else understands that Steve's mission creates a unique opportunity, and that someone is Victor Von Doom. Because Doom wouldn't necessarily need to control Steve. He would only need to create a situation where Steve believes he is making the decision himself. That's the difference between force and manipulation. Force tells you what to do. Manipulation makes you believe the choice was yours. And Steve Rogers is almost impossible to force. But Steve Rogers is human. And beneath the shield, beneath the super soldier serum, beneath the symbol of Captain America, there has always been one enormous, unresolved part of his life: Peggy. Steve lost her before he ever had the chance to truly live with her. He woke up in a future where everyone he knew was gone. He watched Bucky grow old while he remained frozen in time. He watched generations of heroes come and go. He fought aliens. He fought machines. He fought governments. He fought his own friends. And every time the world asked him to sacrifice something, Steve did it. Because that's who he was. He always chose the mission. He always chose everyone else. So when Steve finally gets the chance to go back, Doom doesn't have to convince him to become selfish. He simply has to convince him that choosing Peggy isn't selfish anymore. That's where Red Skull becomes important. Imagine Steve arriving on Vormir with the Soul Stone. He expects a simple exchange: return the stone, move on. But Red Skull knows exactly which words to use. He doesn't have to threaten Steve. He doesn't even have to attack him. He can simply remind Steve of what he's lost. Everything. His old life, his youth, his friends, his home, and Peggy. Perhaps Red Skull tells him something that sounds almost comforting. You've already given enough. The war is over. The Avengers won. The world survived. You've spent your entire life sacrificing yourself for people who kept asking for more. Why not take something for yourself? And Steve would probably reject the idea at first, because that's Steve. He would say the mission comes first, but then comes the question Doom actually wants him to ask. What if the mission doesn't require you to keep sacrificing? What if you can return the stones and still go back? What if you can finish what you were supposed to do? And then, finally, live the life that was taken from you? That's the perfect manipulation, because Steve doesn't need permission to love Peggy. He needs permission to stop sacrificing, and Doom can give him that permission. Not because Doom cares about Steve, but because Doom understands the value of a single emotional decision. Steve thinks he's choosing happiness. Doom sees a timeline anomaly. That's the difference, and this is where the entire meaning of Steve's Endgame ending could change. Because officially, the purpose of the Stone Return mission was simple. The stones had to go back to the moments they were taken so that the timeline wouldn't be left permanently damaged by the Avengers' time travel. Steve was supposed to restore what had been disturbed, but what if one final decision created the disturbance no one noticed? Steve goes back. Steve changes his own life. Steve remains in the past. Steve lives decades that he was never originally supposed to live, and even if he doesn't immediately interfere with major historical events, his existence alone creates a different chain of possibilities, different conversations, different relationships, different decisions, different consequences. A Steve Rogers who lives with Peggy isn't the same Steve Rogers who disappeared into the ice, and that means the world around him isn't exactly the same world either. Maybe some changes are tiny. Maybe some are enormous. Maybe Steve knows better than to interfere directly. Maybe he deliberately stays hidden. But that's not really the point. The point is that a branch exists. And if Doom understands the multiverse better than almost anyone, then he doesn't need that branch to immediately destroy reality. He needs it to exist. Because a branch is a possibility, and possibilities are exactly what a multiversal manipulator can weaponize. This is where Doom's plan becomes much more dangerous than simply destroying universes. Maybe Doom doesn't want to destroy the multiverse. Maybe he wants to control what survives it. That's a very different objective. Incursions are usually presented as disasters. Two universes collide. Reality becomes unstable. Entire worlds become threatened. Eventually, one universe may have to be destroyed to save another. But imagine someone looking at that chaos differently. Not as the end of everything, but as an opportunity. If enough universes begin collapsing into one another, the boundaries between realities become weaker. Worlds overlap. Characters cross paths, histories contradict each other, entire universes become unstable, and somewhere in the middle of that chaos, Doom could be waiting. Because if you can control what remains after the collapse, you don't need to conquer every universe. You simply need to survive the destruction of enough of them, and then rebuild reality according to your own rules. That is where Battleworld enters the picture. The idea becomes much darker if Doom's plan didn't begin when Avengers Doomsday begins. What if Doomsday is only the moment when the plan becomes visible? What if the real plan started years earlier? What if the first move was made at the end of Endgame? Steve returns the stones. Steve reaches Vormir. Red Skull manipulates him. Doom's influence gives Steve a reason to stay, and Steve makes one decision that appears completely harmless. He chooses Peggy. But that choice creates a different timeline. That timeline becomes another branch. That branch contributes to a larger web of realities. And somewhere down the line, those realities begin colliding. At first, nobody connects the events. Why would they? Why would anyone look at a cosmic, multiversal crisis and think about an old man sitting on a bench? That's what makes the theory so interesting. The beginning of the crisis could be hidden inside one of the most peaceful scenes in the MCU. There are no explosions, no armies, no portals, no warning from the TVA, just Steve Rogers sitting beside a lake, a man who finally got the life he wanted, and perhaps that is exactly why nobody questioned it. Because emotionally, the ending feels perfect. Steve deserved Peggy. Steve deserved happiness. After everything he sacrificed, seeing him finally dance with her feels like closure. But from a multiverse perspective, what if it was the opening move? And there's another layer to this. Steve doesn't necessarily have to meet Doctor Doom directly. In fact, it might make the theory stronger if he doesn't. Doom's greatest strength could be that Steve never realizes he was involved. Red Skull becomes the visible connection. Doom stays behind the curtain. Steve encounters Red Skull. Red Skull gives him the choice. Maybe Red Skull says there is another way. Maybe Steve doesn't even understand why this option is suddenly available. And perhaps Doom appears only for a moment, long enough to explain that the timeline can survive, long enough to make the impossible sound reasonable, long enough to plant one idea in Steve's mind. You can complete your mission and still go back to Peggy, then he's gone. Steve is left with the choice. And because the choice is emotionally everything he's ever wanted, he takes it. That's what makes the manipulation so cruel. Doom doesn't take Peggy away from Steve. He gives Peggy to him. He doesn't destroy Steve's dream. He uses it. And Red Skull would be the perfect person to deliver that temptation because he understands the man behind the shield. Red Skull knows Steve's greatest strength. Steve will sacrifice himself for everyone. So Red Skull simply has to make Steve believe that, for once, sacrifice isn't necessary. You've done enough. You've saved enough people. You've paid your debt. Live. And Steve does, which means the tragedy isn't that Steve made an evil choice. He didn't. He made a human one. And that distinction could become incredibly important if this ever becomes part of Avengers Doomsday. Because imagine the Avengers eventually discovering that the incursions aren't random. They begin tracing the timeline backward, past the recent multiversal disturbances, past the universes colliding, past the strange fractures in reality, until they reach the earliest divergence. And then someone asks the question, when did all of this actually begin? The answer isn't a cosmic war. It isn't Doctor Doom appearing in the present. It isn't even the first universe colliding with another. The answer is much smaller. A man returning the Infinity Stones, a man standing on Vormir, a choice. And that choice belongs to Steve Rogers. Suddenly, the ending of Endgame looks completely different. The bench, the old man, the shield, the life with Peggy, everything we thought represented Steve's victory could suddenly become evidence that something went wrong. Because Steve was supposed to return the stones and restore the timeline. Instead, perhaps his final mission created the first crack, and Doom was simply waiting for that crack to become useful. The most disturbing part is that Steve may never have known. He could have spent decades believing that everything was fine. He could have lived with Peggy. He could have watched history unfold. He could have quietly protected the timeline from the shadows, believing that his sacrifice was finally over. Meanwhile, somewhere beyond his reality, Doom could have been watching the consequences accumulate. One branch, then another, until the multiverse becomes fragile enough to break, and by the time Steve realizes what happened, it may already be too late. Because by then, the question wouldn't be whether Steve Rogers caused the multiverse crisis. The question would be whether he was ever allowed to make that choice in the first place, and that distinction changes everything. Because Steve's entire identity is built around free will. He follows orders when they are right, but he has never been the kind of soldier who blindly obeys authority. When the government told him to stay out of the fight, he went anyway. When S.H.I.E.L.D. was compromised, he refused to trust the system. When the Avengers turned against each other, Steve chose what he believed was morally right, even when it meant standing against his own friends. So if Doom wanted to manipulate Steve, he couldn't simply tell him what to do. Steve would recognize that immediately. He would resist, he would fight back, he would become Captain America again. Doom needed something much more sophisticated. He needed Steve to believe that the decision belonged entirely to him, and that's why Peggy is so important. Because Steve Rogers could reject an army. He could reject a government. He could reject a command, but rejecting the possibility of finally living the life he lost is something much harder, especially when someone has convinced him that doing so won't hurt anyone. And that's where the timeline itself becomes the weapon. Steve doesn't have to intentionally change history. He doesn't need to reveal future technology to Peggy. He doesn't need to stop Hydra before the events we know. He doesn't need to become some secret ruler of the 20th century. The mere fact that he remains there creates possibilities that shouldn't exist. Imagine two versions of history running alongside each other. In one, Steve Rogers disappears into the Arctic and eventually wakes up in the modern world. In another, Steve Rogers survives World War II, lives with Peggy Carter, and experiences decades of history from a completely different position. Even if Steve tries his absolute best not to interfere, he is still there. He knows the future. He knows where wars will happen. He knows which people will become heroes. He knows which technologies will eventually exist. He knows things no normal person in that era could possibly know. And perhaps Steve has enough discipline to keep all of that information to himself. But what about everyone around him? What about Peggy? What about the people who meet him? What about the decisions made simply because Steve Rogers existed in that timeline? History doesn't need a massive change to become a different history. Sometimes one person standing in the wrong place is enough. And this is where the theory connects to something much bigger than Steve himself. Because an altered timeline doesn't necessarily have to remain isolated forever. The multiverse gives those branches somewhere to go. They can develop independently. They can create different versions of events, different heroes, different villains, different outcomes. And eventually, those universes can become aware of one another. That's when the real danger begins. Because once two realities begin occupying the same space, the problem is no longer simply that one timeline changed. The problem is that two versions of reality are now competing to exist. And if Doom understands that process, then he could deliberately encourage it. He wouldn't need to create every universe himself. He wouldn't need to control every hero. He would simply need to push the right dominoes at the right moments. Steve could be the first domino. The incursions could be the chain reaction, and Battleworld could be the destination. That also changes how we could look at Dr. Doom's relationship with Red Skull. Because Red Skull doesn't necessarily need to understand the entire plan. In fact, he probably shouldn't. If Doom is truly playing a long game, giving Red Skull the complete picture would create an unnecessary risk. Red Skull wants Steve Rogers to suffer. That's enough. Doom can give him the revenge he wants while secretly using that revenge for something much larger. Red Skull believes he is finally getting the opportunity to break Captain America. Doom knows that he's actually helping break reality itself. And that creates a fascinating hierarchy of manipulation. Steve is manipulated by Red Skull. Red Skull is manipulated by Doom. And Doom is manipulating the conditions of the multiverse. Every person involved believes they're pursuing their own objective. Only Doom knows how all of those objectives connect. That makes the Vormir encounter potentially one of the most important unseen moments in Steve Rogers' entire story. We know what Vormir means to the Avengers. Natasha died there. Clint nearly sacrificed himself there. Thanos had already committed one of the most horrifying acts in the MCU there. It is a place where love, sacrifice, and loss are connected directly to the Soul Stone. And then Steve arrives there carrying that same stone, except this time, the person standing before him isn't another Avenger. It's Red Skull. The one enemy from Steve's original life who has been transformed into a guardian of the place. If there were ever a location where Steve's past could literally come back to confront him, it would be Vormir. And if Doom needed to reach Steve emotionally, he couldn't ask for a better stage. The man who represented Steve's old enemy is waiting in a place built around sacrifice, holding the final reminder of everything Steve has lost. That's not just convenient. Within this theory, it's almost perfect. And perhaps Red Skull doesn't even have to lie about everything. That's what would make the manipulation believable. He could tell Steve that the timeline can survive. He could tell him that some branches already exist. He could tell him that the Avengers' own time travel has already changed things. He could even tell Steve that returning the stones isn't enough to guarantee that everything goes back exactly the way it was. And technically, Steve might have no way to know whether he's being told the truth. Because this is one of the biggest unanswered questions surrounding the in-game time travel rules. The Avengers understand enough to perform the mission, but Steve is the one person who disappears for an extended period and comes back with almost no explanation. That unexplained gap gives the theory room to breathe. Steve doesn't have to be stupid. He doesn't have to suddenly forget everything he knows about time travel. He only needs to be given incomplete information at the exact moment when his emotions are strongest. And maybe that's why Steve's decision is so quiet. There is no dramatic declaration that he's changing history. No villain standing over him announcing a master plan. Just a man who has spent his entire life putting duty first, finally asking himself a different question. What if I don't have to anymore? What if I can go back? What if I can have the dance? What if I can wake up every morning next to Peggy instead of spending another decade wondering what I missed? And for perhaps the first time in his life, Steve says yes. Not to a mission, not to a war, not to the Avengers, to himself. That is exactly why the eventual reveal could hurt so much, because Steve's life with Peggy wouldn't necessarily be fake. And that's important. Doom wouldn't need to create a fake Peggy. He wouldn't need to fabricate their relationship. He wouldn't need to put Steve inside some artificial reality. The life could have been completely real. The love could have been completely real. The memories could have been completely real. And that's what makes the manipulation so devastating. Doom didn't have to fake Steve's happiness. He only had to make sure Steve reached it through the wrong door. And if Steve eventually discovers that truth, the emotional consequences could be enormous, because he would be forced to confront something he has spent his entire life avoiding. His greatest strength, his willingness to sacrifice, was also the part of him Doom understood best. Steve always believed that if he could save everyone else, the cost to himself didn't matter. Doom simply turned that principle upside down. He made Steve believe that choosing himself was harmless. And because Steve wanted that choice so badly, he never questioned why the opportunity had suddenly become possible. Now imagine Steve standing face to face with Doom years later. Not as the young soldier who fought Red Skull, not as the Avenger who fought Thanos, but as the old man who has finally discovered the truth about the life he thought was his own. Doom doesn't need to insult Peggy. He doesn't need to say the relationship was meaningless. He can simply tell Steve the truth. You wanted a life with her. I gave you the opportunity. And Steve could realize the horrifying difference between giving someone a choice and engineering the circumstances around that choice. Because that's what Doom does. He doesn't have to control the decision, he controls the options. And once Steve understands that, the entire in-game ending becomes tragic in a completely different way. The shield wasn't simply passed down because Steve was ready to retire. Maybe Steve was already living with the consequences of something he didn't understand. Maybe the old man on that bench wasn't just a retired hero. Maybe he was a man who had unknowingly spent decades sitting at the center of a multiversal anomaly. And there is another question that makes the theory even more dangerous. What if Steve's timeline wasn't the only one Doom manipulated? What if Steve was simply the first successful experiment? Think about the way Doom would approach the multiverse. He doesn't need to manipulate every reality in exactly the same way. He only needs to understand what each universe values most. In one universe, it might be power. In another, it might be survival. In another, it might be love. In another, it might be revenge. Doom could exploit those desires and push different realities toward different outcomes, creating conditions where their timelines eventually become incompatible. Steve's story would then be the earliest example of the strategy. Find the emotional weakness, present the choice, let the person make it willingly, allow the timeline to fracture, then wait. And if that's true, then the incursions aren't simply accidents. They're consequences. The multiverse isn't collapsing because nobody knows how to stop it. It's collapsing because someone has been making sure the right realities collide. That would also give Doctor Doom a completely different role in the Avengers story. He wouldn't be another villain who arrives and says, "I want to rule everything." He would be the person who understands that the old multiverse is already broken and believes that only he has the intelligence and strength to rebuild it. From Doom's perspective, he might even believe he's saving reality. If countless universes are destined to destroy one another, why allow the chaos to continue? Why not take the strongest pieces, eliminate the contradictions, and create something new? A world where Doom controls the rules. A world where the survivors owe their existence to him. A world assembled from the ruins of realities that once existed independently. Battle World. And suddenly, the name means something different. It's not just a world Doom creates after the multiverse collapses. It becomes the final product of a plan that began years earlier. Steve Rogers creates the first deviation. Other timelines follow. The multiverse becomes increasingly unstable. Incursions begin. Heroes from different realities collide. The Avengers and X-Men blame each other. Universes fight for survival. And while everyone is trying to save their own reality, Doom positions himself as the only person capable of saving what remains. That's the perfect trap. Because when the universe is burning, the person offering to build a new one can look like a savior. And this could explain why different heroes might initially believe Doom is right. Imagine an Avengers team watching their reality disappear. Imagine the X-Men seeing their universe collapse. Imagine heroes who have spent their entire lives protecting their worlds suddenly being told there is only one way to preserve anything at all. Doom can offer them survival, not victory, not justice, survival. And survival is a much easier bargain to accept when everything you love is disappearing. That's why Steve Rogers becomes so important to the emotional side of this story, because Steve understands what it means to lose an entire world. He already lived through it once. He woke up 70 years later and discovered that the world he knew was gone. Now imagine him watching the multiverse suffer the same fate. Except this time, he knows that his own decision may have helped create it. That could force Steve into the most painful choice of his entire life. Does he try to undo the timeline he created? Does he risk erasing the life he had with Peggy? Does he sacrifice his own happiness to repair the damage? And if Peggy's timeline has children, friends, memories, an entire life built around Steve's presence, then undoing it isn't as simple as pressing a reset button. There are innocent people inside that timeline. People who never asked to become part of Doom's plan. People whose entire existence depends on the choice Steve made. So Steve would once again face the same impossible question that defined his character from the beginning. How much of himself is he willing to sacrifice to save everyone else? Except this time, the sacrifice is different. The first time, Steve sacrificed his future. Now he may have to sacrifice his past. And that is where the Captain America paradox reaches its most painful point. The man who spent his entire life trying to find his way back home may finally have to give up the home he found, because maybe the only way to stop Doom is to undo the very choice Doom manipulated. And if Steve is the one person who can do that, then the shield he passed to Sam Wilson may not have been the end of his story. It may have been the beginning of the final sacrifice, because Steve Rogers has always believed that the right choice is the one that protects everyone else, even when it destroys you. Doom simply found a way to make that belief hurt more than ever before. And now the tragedy becomes even deeper. because Steve would have to confront the possibility that the life he fought so hard to protect is also the life he may have to surrender. For decades, Peggy was the one thing Steve never got to have. She was the unfinished sentence in his story, the dance they never had, the future they never shared. So when Steve finally returned to the past, it wasn't just a romantic ending, it was the fulfillment of a promise that had been waiting since the beginning of the MCU. And that's precisely why Doom's manipulation would be so devastating. Steve didn't fall for a random temptation. He fell for the one thing that had always been impossible for him to let go of. He finally believed the universe was giving him back what it had taken away. But if Doom engineered that opportunity, then Steve's greatest reward becomes the mechanism of his greatest failure. Peggy wasn't the trap because she was fake. Peggy was the trap because she was real. And that distinction could completely redefine the meaning of Steve's final scene in Endgame. The audience sees an old man sitting peacefully, watching Sam approach with the shield. We see Steve smile. We see that familiar sense of peace. After everything, Captain America is finally okay. But imagine watching that same scene again after Avengers Doomsday reveals the truth. Suddenly, the smile means something different. Maybe Steve wasn't simply happy. Maybe he was relieved. Maybe he had spent decades believing that he had finally found the correct ending to his story. And perhaps the audience realizes something Steve himself didn't know. The moment he chose Peggy was the moment Doom's plan became possible. That would also make Steve's relationship with Peggy even more emotionally complicated, because Peggy may eventually become one of the few people capable of understanding what happened. She knows Steve better than almost anyone. She knows his instincts. She knows how deeply he values duty. If Steve eventually tells her that their life together may have been manipulated, she might be the one person who refuses to let him destroy it simply because Doom used it. And that creates a heartbreaking conflict. Peggy could tell him that what Doom intended doesn't erase what they lived. The love was still theirs. The memories were still theirs. The years they spent together were still real. Doom may have manipulated the circumstances, but he didn't own the life they created inside those circumstances. That idea becomes incredibly important because it prevents the story from reducing Peggy into nothing more than bait. She wasn't. She was the person Steve loved. And if this theory ever became canon, the emotional power would come from Steve realizing that two things can be true at the same time. Doom manipulated his choice, and the happiness that followed was still genuine. His life with Peggy wasn't meaningless just because someone else wanted to weaponize it. In fact, that could make Steve's eventual decision even harder. He wouldn't be choosing between a fake life and the real world. He would be choosing between two real lives, knowing that one of them may have to disappear to save everyone else. And that's exactly the kind of impossible decision Captain America has always been built around. But there is another piece of the puzzle: Red Skull. Because if Steve eventually discovers that Red Skull was involved, he has to confront the person who started this chain of events. And Red Skull's role becomes much more interesting if he isn't simply a servant of Doom. Maybe he believed he was finally defeating Steve Rogers. Maybe he genuinely thought that giving Steve a chance at Peggy was the perfect way to corrupt the symbol of Captain America. After all, Red Skull's entire philosophy was built around the idea that people are ultimately driven by power, desire, and self-interest. Steve was the exception. Steve proved that sacrifice could be stronger than ambition. So Red Skull's ultimate revenge wouldn't be killing Steve. It would be proving Steve could be tempted. Imagine Red Skull telling Doom that Steve will never choose himself, and Doom responding that everyone chooses themselves when you offer them the right thing. That conversation would tell us everything about the difference between these two villains. Red Skull wants to destroy Steve's ideals. Doom wants to use them. Red Skull wants Steve to fall. Doom wants Steve to keep walking without realizing he's already fallen. One is revenge. The other is strategy. And perhaps Red Skull only realizes too late that Doom never cared about his revenge, because once Steve makes the choice, Red Skull has served his purpose. Doom doesn't need him anymore. That could create another fascinating twist later in the story. Red Skull may eventually realize that he was manipulated too. He thought he was helping destroy Captain America, but Doom was using his hatred to create something much larger. And if Red Skull discovers that his revenge contributed to the collapse of the multiverse, then even he has a reason to turn against Doom. Not because Red Skull suddenly becomes a hero, but because Doom took his victory away from him. And that creates an unlikely triangle. Steve wants to repair what he unknowingly broke. Red Skull wants revenge against the man who manipulated him. Doom wants to complete the collapse and build his new reality. For the first time, all three have conflicting reasons to stop each other, and the irony is almost perfect. Steve and Red Skull spent their entire lives on opposite sides, yet Doom's manipulation could force them into the same fight, not because they forgive each other, not because Red Skull becomes good, but because they finally understand who the real enemy is. And that is where the theory could connect directly to the larger Avengers conflict. Because if Doom's plan depends on heroes fighting each other while universes collapse, then Steve's revelation becomes the one piece of information capable of changing the entire battlefield. The Avengers might believe the X-Men are responsible. The X-Men might believe the Avengers caused the incursion. Fantastic Four could be trying to calculate which universes are colliding and why. Loki could understand that something is wrong with the structure of reality itself. And Doom could be standing in the middle of all of them, allowing every side to believe it is fighting for survival. But then Steve discovers the first domino, and suddenly the conflict stops being Avengers versus X-Men. It becomes everyone versus Doom. That doesn't mean the heroes immediately trust one another. In fact, they probably shouldn't. If multiple universes have already been damaged by incursions, every hero has a reason to believe the other side is dangerous. Some may even believe destroying another universe is the only way to save their own. Doom can exploit that fear because fear makes people predictable. Steve, however, understands something they don't. The problem isn't the other universe. The problem is the person making them believe they have to destroy each other. And that would give Steve a very different role in the final conflict. He wouldn't simply return as Captain America. He would return as the person who understands the beginning of the crisis. He would know that the multiverse didn't suddenly break. It was pushed, manipulated, guided, and the first person who was manipulated was him. That could also explain why Doom would specifically want Steve Rogers alive. If Doom's objective were simply to destroy the Avengers, Steve wouldn't be necessary. There are hundreds of ways to eliminate a super soldier. But if Steve is living proof that Doom's manipulation worked, then Steve becomes something much more valuable, a symbol, a warning, and potentially a weapon. Doom could expose the truth publicly. He could tell the Avengers that their own Captain America created the first branch. He could reveal that Steve chose Peggy. He could make the heroes believe that Steve is responsible for everything happening around them. Imagine what that would do to the Avengers. Some would defend him. Some would question him. Some would wonder whether Steve should have known better. And Steve himself wouldn't deny it. Because even if he was manipulated, he still made the choice. That is what makes the story emotionally powerful. Steve wouldn't stand there and say, "None of this is my fault." He would say, "I was wrong." And that is something we've rarely seen from Steve Rogers at this scale. Not a mistake on the battlefield, not a disagreement with Tony. Not a political decision, a decision that potentially affected reality itself. But Steve would also understand something Doom doesn't. Being manipulated doesn't mean you stop having a choice. It means you have to make a new one. And that could become the foundation of Steve's final journey. The first choice created the problem. The final choice has to fix it, which brings us back to the Infinity Stones. Because if Steve's original mission was to return the stones, then perhaps repairing the damage requires understanding exactly what happened during that journey. Maybe every stone was returned correctly. Maybe Steve completed the mission exactly as intended, and then he made one decision afterward. He stayed. That means the mistake wasn't in returning the stones. The mistake was what happened after the mission was complete. And that distinction matters because it means Steve wasn't careless. He didn't fail because he couldn't follow instructions. He failed because someone gave him a reason to believe that he could safely break the one rule that mattered. Don't change the timeline. And maybe Doom's most powerful lie was never that Steve could stay. It was that staying wouldn't matter. That one branch couldn't possibly affect the wider multiverse. That one choice was too small to matter. But Doom understood something Steve didn't. In a multiverse, there are no small choices. Every possibility creates another possibility. Every branch creates another history. Every history creates another universe. And given enough time, enough universes become enough instability. Until reality itself becomes the battlefield. That is why Steve's decision could be the perfect opening move. Not because it immediately caused an incursion, but because it created one more universe that Doom could eventually use. And if Doom had spent years watching these realities evolve, then perhaps he wasn't waiting for Steve to make another mistake. He was waiting for the right moment to collect the consequences. The first time we see Doom's plan, it might look like destruction. But the deeper truth could be that destruction was never the goal. Selection was. Doom lets universes collide. He watches which realities survive. He identifies the strongest heroes, the most powerful technology, the most valuable locations, the most useful versions of history. Then he takes the surviving pieces. He doesn't rebuild the multiverse as it was. He builds something new, something controlled, something where every surviving reality becomes part of a single world, battle world, and suddenly the name takes on an almost horrifying meaning. It's not a random battlefield created by a villain. It's a museum of everything Doom decided was worth saving. A world assembled from the ruins of realities that failed his test, and the heroes living there might not even realize the truth at first. They might believe they've survived. They might believe Doom saved them, until they discover that their worlds weren't saved. They were harvested. And Steve Rogers would have a unique reason to understand exactly what Doom has done. Because he was the first piece Doom ever moved, the first human being whose deepest desire was turned into a multiversal weapon, the first proof that reality doesn't always need to be conquered by force. Sometimes, all you need is to convince someone to open the door themselves. And if that is the real secret behind Steve's Endgame ending, then the most important scene of Avengers Doomsday might not be a battle at all. It could be a conversation between Steve Rogers and Dr. Doom. Doom tells Steve that everything began with him. Steve asks why, and Doom simply explains that he didn't need Captain America to lose. He needed Captain America to win, because Steve wanted something pure, something human, something he had earned. And Doom knew that if he gave Steve exactly what he wanted, Steve would never suspect that the gift itself was part of the trap. Then Steve finally understands. The life with Peggy was real, the love was real, the happiness was real, but the choice had been engineered. And Doom's greatest weapon was never time travel, it was Steve's hope. That is the Captain America paradox. Steve Rogers spent his entire life believing that sacrifice was the price of doing the right thing. Doom convinced him for one brief moment that he didn't have to sacrifice anymore. And that single moment may have been enough to put the entire multiverse on a path toward collapse. But if there is one thing Doom may have forgotten, it is that Steve Rogers has never been defined by the mistakes he makes. He's defined by what he does after he realizes them. And that means the final chapter of this story wouldn't be about Steve proving that he was innocent. It would be about Steve deciding what he's willing to sacrifice now. Because if the only way to stop Doom is to undo the timeline he created, then Steve may have to face the one thing he has spent his entire life trying to avoid: letting Peggy go. Again. And this time, there would be no promise that he could ever find his way back to her. That is what would make Steve's final decision so powerful. The first time he lost Peggy, he didn't choose it. He was frozen beneath the ice, trapped in a future that had moved on without him. The second time, he chose her. He finally stepped into the past and lived the life he always wanted. But if that life became part of Doom's plan, then Steve would be forced to make a sacrifice that is completely different from anything we've seen before. He wouldn't be sacrificing his life. He wouldn't be sacrificing his future. He would be sacrificing the life he actually chose. The one thing he believed was finally his. And that would bring the story back to the core of who Steve Rogers has always been. Captain America isn't great because he never wants anything for himself. He's great because when the moment comes, he can still choose what is right, even when it costs him everything. And perhaps this is where the title, The Captain America Paradox, truly earns its meaning. Steve's greatest desire created the greatest danger. His happiest memory became the source of his greatest regret. His attempt to finally live for himself became another form of sacrifice, and the only way out is to make the same choice he has made his entire life. Put everyone else first. But this time there is something different. Steve isn't being ordered to do it. Nobody is forcing him. There is no government telling him what to do, no commander giving him instructions, no villain threatening the people he loves. This time, he understands exactly what he's losing, and he chooses it anyway. That makes the sacrifice more meaningful because it is completely his. Imagine Doom trying to stop him by using the one thing he knows Steve cannot easily abandon: Peggy. Doom could tell him that the timeline Steve created contains decades of memories, people, relationships, and a life that can't simply be erased without consequences. He could remind Steve that Peggy isn't an illusion. She's real. Their marriage was real. Their years together were real. The people they touched were real. If Steve resets the timeline, all of that disappears. Doom doesn't need to fight Steve. He only needs to make him hesitate. Because for the first time, Steve isn't fighting for something abstract. He's fighting against losing the person he loves all over again, and Steve would probably hesitate. That's important. He shouldn't immediately make the heroic choice. Steve is human. He has spent his entire life losing people, and Peggy was the one loss he finally got back. If he has to give her up again, it should hurt. It should feel impossible. Because the audience needs to understand exactly what Steve is sacrificing. Otherwise, the moment doesn't carry the weight it deserves. Steve could look at Peggy and realize that this time, he doesn't get to keep both worlds. He can't save the multiverse and keep his life exactly as it was. Somewhere, a version of reality has to disappear. And once again, Steve Rogers is standing at the edge of a choice that nobody else can make for him. But maybe Peggy is the one who makes that choice easier. Not by telling him to leave, by reminding him who he is. She could tell him that she never loved Captain America because he was a symbol. She loved Steve because of the man underneath it. And if saving millions of lives means letting go of the life they built together, then she knows what Steve will do. She has always known. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part is that she doesn't ask him to stay. She tells him to go. Because Peggy understands something Doom never will. Steve's ability to sacrifice isn't a weakness. It is the reason people trust him. Doom can manipulate Steve's desire, but he can never completely erase Steve's conscience. The moment Steve understands the consequences, the manipulation loses its power. That would also give Steve and Peggy's relationship a much more meaningful conclusion than simply ending with a goodbye. Their first goodbye was caused by war. Their second goodbye would be caused by a choice. The first time, Steve promised to come back. The second time, he might know that he never can. And perhaps that's the final lesson of their relationship. Sometimes loving someone doesn't mean holding on to them forever. Sometimes it means being willing to let them go when the world needs you to. And if Steve returns to the battlefield after making that sacrifice, Doom would realize something important. The Steve Rogers he manipulated no longer exists. The man who wanted a life with Peggy at any cost is gone. The man standing in front of Doom now is the Captain America who spent his entire life choosing the harder path. And that's why Doom's greatest mistake could be underestimating Steve after the manipulation is revealed. Doom believes people are predictable because their desires make them predictable. But Steve's defining trait isn't what he wants. It's what he's willing to give up. Doom can understand greed. He can understand fear. He can understand ambition. He can understand revenge. But genuine self-sacrifice is much harder to calculate. Because from Doom's perspective, every person should eventually choose survival. Steve doesn't, and that could be the one variable Doom never accounted for. The entire plan depends on people protecting their own universes. The Avengers fight the X-Men because each side wants its reality to survive. Different heroes make different compromises. Doom presents himself as the only person capable of saving them. And then Steve walks into the middle of that conflict and does something completely irrational from Doom's perspective. He chooses everyone, not his universe, not Peggy, not his timeline, everyone. That is the moment Steve Rogers becomes dangerous to Doom again, because the multiverse may be collapsing, but Steve's answer isn't to choose which reality deserves to survive. His answer is to find a way to save as many as possible, and if there is no way to save them all, he is willing to sacrifice himself to create one. That would make the final confrontation much more than another superhero battle. Doom could have more power, more technology, more knowledge, more control over reality itself. Steve doesn't need to beat him by being stronger. He needs to beat him by refusing to play the game Doom designed. Doom built a system around manipulation. Steve breaks the system by making a choice Doom can't exploit. And that could lead to the ultimate irony. The first time Steve went back through time, he created a branch Doom could manipulate. The final time he travels through time, he closes it. The first journey was about returning what the Avengers had taken. The final journey is about returning reality to what it was supposed to be. And perhaps Steve finally understands the lesson that Doom never expected him to learn. You cannot protect the future by refusing to let go of the past. That is the emotional core of the entire theory. Because Steve's story has always been about the past, the old uniform, the old photographs, the old friends, the old promises, the dance he never had. He spent decades trying to recover something that time had taken away. And eventually, he succeeded. But the multiverse doesn't care how much you love something. Reality doesn't care how deserved your happiness is. And Doom understands that better than almost anyone. That's why Doom's manipulation works. He doesn't attack Steve's strength, he attacks his nostalgia. He takes the most beautiful part of Steve's history and turns it into a doorway. But Steve's final victory would come from understanding that history cannot be protected by freezing it. You have to let it move forward. And that idea would connect perfectly to the larger themes of the multiverse saga. We've spent years watching characters confront alternate versions of themselves. Different choices, different lives, different futures. Some versions are better, some are worse, some are completely unrecognizable. The multiverse constantly asks the same question. If another version of your life existed, would you choose it? Steve's answer at the end of Endgame was yes. For the first time, he chose the life he had lost. But Avengers Doomsday could ask the second question. What if that choice has consequences? And Steve's final answer could be different. This time, he chooses to let it go. Not because it wasn't real, because it was. Not because Peggy didn't matter, because she did. Not because he regrets loving her, because he doesn't. He lets her go because protecting the lives of billions matters more than protecting the life he wanted for himself. And suddenly, Steve Rogers' entire journey becomes a circle. He begins as a man willing to sacrifice himself for strangers. He becomes a hero who sacrifices himself for the world. He becomes an Avenger who sacrifices his happiness for his friends. Then, at the end of Endgame, he finally chooses himself. And in the final chapter, he learns that even when you finally get everything you've ever wanted, you may still have to let it go. That would make his story feel complete, but there is still one final piece: the Red Skull. Because if Steve is the one who discovers the truth, someone needs to answer for the manipulation. And perhaps that confrontation wouldn't happen between Steve and Doom first. It would happen between Steve and Red Skull. The two men who began this story would finally stand face to face again. Except now, the circumstances are completely different. Steve knows the truth. Red Skull knows Doom used him. And for the first time, neither of them has anything left to hide. Red Skull could tell Steve that he never forced him. Steve chose Peggy. Steve chose the past. Steve chose the life. And technically, Red Skull would be right. Steve could respond that the choice was designed. Red Skull could say that every choice is influenced by something. And maybe Steve finally realizes that the difference isn't whether someone influenced you. The difference is what you do once you know. That could be the moment where Steve stops blaming Red Skull. Not because Red Skull deserves forgiveness, but because Steve understands that Doom is the real threat. Red Skull was the hand, Doom was the mind. And perhaps Red Skull's final act is to reveal something Doom never wanted Steve to know. The exact moment when Doom first discovered the possibility, the reason Steve was targeted, the real purpose of the branch. Maybe Doom had been searching for a universe where the Avengers could be divided before they even knew they were being divided. Maybe he realized that the perfect multiversal weapon wasn't an Infinity Stone. It was a choice, a human choice. Something so small that nobody would notice it until the consequences became impossible to stop. And Steve Rogers was perfect because everyone trusted him. If Steve changed his timeline, nobody would immediately suspect him. If Steve believed everything was fine, everyone else would believe it too. The most trusted man in the Avengers unknowingly became the carrier of Doom's first anomaly, and that makes the title even darker. The Captain America paradox isn't simply that Steve caused the crisis, it's that the person trying hardest to protect the timeline may have been the one who unknowingly damaged it. And Doom knew exactly how to make that happen, not through violence, through hope. That is what makes this theory so compelling. Because the real villainy isn't that Doom destroyed Steve's life. It's that Doom gave Steve exactly the life he wanted and turned it into a weapon against everyone else. And if Avengers Doomsday ever revealed that Steve Rogers was the first domino, it would completely transform the way we look at the end of Endgame. That peaceful bench wouldn't just be a goodbye, it would be a clue. The old Steve Rogers wouldn't just represent retirement. He would represent the consequence of one impossible decision. Peggy wouldn't just represent Steve's happy ending. She would represent the one thing Doom used to make Steve lower his guard. And the Stone Return mission wouldn't just be a plot device. It would become the hidden beginning of the multiverse crisis. Because Steve thought he was closing the story, he was actually opening the door. And Doom was waiting on the other side. The most important thing, though, is that this theory doesn't require Steve to become a villain. He never betrays the Avengers. He never joins Doom. He never intentionally damages reality. He never stops being Captain America. That's what makes it tragic. Steve Rogers remains Steve Rogers the entire time. He simply makes one decision that anyone could understand. He chooses the woman he loves. He chooses the life he never had. He chooses happiness, and Doom takes that beautiful human choice and turns it into something catastrophic. That's the kind of twist that would hurt because nobody is completely wrong. Steve was right to want Peggy. Peggy was right to love Steve. Red Skull was right that Steve could be tempted. Doom was right that one choice could change reality. But only Steve is capable of recognizing that a choice can be understandable and still have consequences. And when the final battle comes, that realization could be more powerful than any weapon. Because Steve Rogers doesn't need to prove that he was never manipulated. He needs to prove that manipulation doesn't define him. Doom may have engineered the first choice, but Steve gets to make the last one. And maybe that is the real reason Steve Rogers returns in Avengers Doomsday. Not because Marvel simply wants Captain America back. Not because the MCU needs another familiar face, but because the story that appeared to end with Steve Rogers sitting beside a lake may have actually been the first chapter of the biggest mistake he ever made. The mistake wasn't loving Peggy. The mistake wasn't wanting a life. The mistake was believing that his story could finally belong only to him. Because Steve Rogers has never existed in isolation. His choices affect people. His sacrifice affects people. His legacy affects people. And in a universe where every decision can create another reality, even the smallest personal choice can become something much larger. That is why the most haunting version of this theory isn't that Doom controlled Steve. It's that Doom never had to. He simply understood Steve better than Steve understood himself. He knew that after a lifetime of sacrifice, all it would take was one promise, one impossible opportunity, one chance to hear the words Steve had been waiting decades to hear. You can go home. And Steve believed him. But now, if Steve returns, he may finally discover what that promise really cost. Because his final mission was never simply about returning the Infinity Stones. It was about returning the multiverse to the point before one choice changed everything. And if Steve has to give up the life he spent decades protecting to do it, then once again, Captain America will have to make the hardest choice of all. He'll have to choose the world over himself. And maybe that's the final irony. Doom thought he had discovered the one thing that could make Steve Rogers selfish. Instead, he discovered the one thing that would eventually make Steve Rogers sacrifice everything all over again. Because you can manipulate Captain America's choices. You can manipulate his memories. You can manipulate his emotions. You can even manipulate the timeline around him. But there is one thing you cannot permanently manipulate. The reason Steve Rogers keeps choosing to stand back up, and that is why, in the end, the multiverse may not be saved by the strongest hero. It may be saved by the man who finally understands that even the life he loves most cannot be more important than the lives of everyone else. Steve Rogers didn't start the multiverse crisis because he was weak. He started it because he was human, and he may be the one who ends it because he is still Captain America. If you enjoyed this theory, make sure to like the video, share it with another Marvel fan, and subscribe to MovieCast for more MCU theories and breakdowns. And if you really enjoyed the video, you can also support MovieCast with a $25 super thanks. It genuinely helps the channel keep these theories coming.